chapter 12. John chapter 12. Read the first 11 verses, or 11 verses. John 12, verses 1 through 11. Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There, in Bethany, they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, let her alone. Against the day of my burying she hath kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. Much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him, Lazarus, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Notice that the text opens with the word then, showing a continuation of what went before. In John chapter 11, verses 45 through verse 47, the religious leaders were conspiring against Christ. In John 11, verse 54, Jesus and the apostles leave Bethany, and they arrive in Ephraim, which was about 13 miles north of Jerusalem. Verse 55 through 57 of chapter 11, we are told that the Jews' Passover was at hand. And the people back in Jerusalem, in the temple, are wondering, and they're speaking amongst themselves whether or not Jesus would come to the Passover feast. And the chief priests and the scribes, they're planning to arrest and kill him if he does come. Coming to John chapter 12, verse 1, then 6 days before the Passover. So we have a time marker, 6 days before the Passover, telling us that this was the last week before the death and burial of Christ. Almost half of the Gospel of John is given to this last week of Christ's life upon earth. So we're informed here that 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, about 2 miles from Jerusalem. Came from Ephraim, about 13 miles, and now he's about 2 miles from Jerusalem. So we have this fact stated in verse 1. 6 days before the Passover feast, Jesus came to Bethany. most people immediately jump to verse 2. But there's such a thing called the harmony of the Gospels. That is, when reading the Gospels, we need to harmonize all accounts. Just reading John's Gospel, you would conclude Jesus comes to Bethany and immediately there's this supper in Simon's house. But that's not so, because of the other gospel accounts. So between verse 1 and verse 2, Jesus is seen in the other Gospels moving between Bethany and Jerusalem. And there are several events that take place not recorded by John, but recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, without going over those events, there's several. You could insert Matthew chapters 21 through 26 between John 12, verse 1, and the remainder of the text. You could put in there Mark chapter 11 through 13. And you could put in there Luke chapters 19 through 21. So you can insert these between verse 1 and verse 2. So what we have here is Jesus at Bethany, verse 1. It's just a fact is stated. Jesus has arrived at Bethany. It's 6 days before the Passover. And then inserting these other accounts, we come to verse 2. There, in Bethany, they made him a supper. They are there using the opportunity that they have. Now, what is recorded in our text is also recorded by Matthew 26, verses 6 through 11, and also by Mark, in Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. And as it is in all the gospel accounts, as you read the individual accounts of the same event, we're able to gather additional information. So Matthew and Mark both record that what took place here was in the house of Simon the leper. Matthew writes in Matthew 26, verse 6, "Now when Jesus was in the house of Simon the leper." Mark records, Mark 14:3, "And being in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper." John writes, John 12, verse 2, "There." That is, at Bethany, but reading the other accounts, it's at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. They made him, Jesus, a supper. Those who were present that are mentioned, Simon the leper was there. Mary was there. Martha was there. Lazarus was there. The apostles were there. And of course, Jesus was there. And John tells us in John 12, verse 9, much people of the Jews were also there. And he tells us why they were there. They came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also. So the scene, we see John in verse 2 says that a supper was provided. And Martha served. Martha served. And I believe that she did so much differently than she did in Luke chapter 10. And John also informs us, John 12 verse 2, that Lazarus, who had been raised from the dead, was one of them that sat at the table with him, that is Jesus. So we picture those at the table. I imagine Lazarus and the other apostles with Jesus. They're enjoying a meal with Him. They're enjoying a time of fellowship with Him. And all three accounts mention what Mary did on this occasion. Only John mentions what Lazarus and Martha did. But all three accounts record what Mary did on this occasion. Matthew says in Matthew 26:7, there came unto him a woman, having an alabaster box of precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat, as he's sitting at that table with Lazarus and the others. Mark says the same in Mark chapter 14, verse 3. But Mark adds that the ointment was spikenard and that it was very precious. That is, valuable and rare. John, verse 3, chapter 12, mentions her by name, Mary. And he tells us that she anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. So the focus of all three accounts is what Mary did with regard to Christ. Now, the overall consensus of those that were gathered concerning what Mary had done was that this was a waste. We see that in Matthew 26, verse 8, Mark 14, verse 4. But Jesus said, Matthew 26, verse 10, she hath wrought a good work upon me. She has done a good work. She's done a good thing. And it's for me. And it's for me. In other words, Christ approved of what she did. Mark 14, verse 9, that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her. That is, what she did was something that would be remembered about her. So in this message, we want to look at Mary's action, not merely as a single act, though it was, but look at it as a life, because it's a memorial unto her. Our subject is a life of awe, love, and appreciation. And what Mary did that day was a display of her awe, her love, and her appreciation. And that should be our whole life. So let's look first of all at the spirit of Mary. This is the third time that we see Mary at the feet of Jesus. And in these three times, there is a spiritual development progression. Mary at the feet of Jesus is much more than a physical posture. It is a posture of soul. 3 separate occasions, and there she is at the feet of Jesus. We see her in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, sitting at the feet of Jesus, and she's listening to Him. She is learning from Him. She is there as a student. The next time we see her is in John chapter 11. The occasion is her brother's death, the death of Lazarus. And again, we see her at the feet of Jesus. She has learned from at the feet of Jesus. And now, in a time of great sorrow and trial, her brother has died. They have buried him. And we read in John 11:32, then when Mary was come where Jesus was and saw Him, she fell down at His feet. She's there in need. She's there in submission. And now here in our text, verse 3, we're told that she anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped His feet with her hair. Now she's there in awe. She's there out of love and appreciation for Him. She is in a position of worship. She is there to honor Him. That's why she's there. Again, Mary at the feet of Jesus. Much more than just a physical posture. A posture of soul. A posture of spirit. In verse 1 of our text, Jesus came to Bethany. So Jesus is there. And now we see Mary positioned at His feet. She is there out of love. She is there out of reverence for them, for Him. She is there because she has a close attachment to Him. There's a bond between Him and her. She is there as one who knows Him. She is there as one who is captivated by Him. She is there and she's filled with wonder. She's filled with amazement at His goodness to her. She is there feeling blessed of Him. She's there in appreciation. She's there in gratitude. And she's there to honor and to praise and worship Him. We meet every Sunday, every Wednesday. Jesus is here. And we ought to be here for the same reasons that Mary was in the house that day. So that's the spirit of Mary. Now let's consider her act. In the house that day, there was Simon the leper. He, at some point in his life, had experienced the healing power of Christ. And there was Lazarus. He had experienced the life-giving, life-raising power of Christ. There was Martha. She had witnessed Jesus raising her brother from the dead and had experienced the comforting power of Christ, and likewise Mary. There were the 11. All 12 were there, but we want to mention the 11. Judas was there also. But the 11 had experienced the saving touch of Jesus Christ. The 11 had been called to follow the King of Kings. And they are there as the recipients of His teaching, His love, His care. They were eyewitnesses of His miracles. And there they are. Simon the leper, Lazarus, Martha, Mary, the apostles. They had all personally experienced the life-changing, life-altering power of Christ. Every one of them had good reason to fall down at the feet of Jesus Christ. But Mary had a propensity to be drawn to the feet of Jesus Christ. Oh, for such a propensity. And on this occasion, verse 3 of John 12, she took a pound of ointment of spikenard. John says it was very costly. And she anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped His feet with her hair. What Mary did was the impulse of awe. It was the impulse of love. It was the impulse of appreciation. So as Jesus sits there at that meal, I can picture Mary looking at Simon the leper and thinking how good and how merciful Christ had been to him. And just thinking of Christ's healing power. And as she thinks upon these things, there's an awe, and there's a love, and there's an appreciation in her heart. And she looks at her brother Lazarus, thinking of Christ's raising power. And again, there's this awe. There's this love. There's this appreciation in her heart. She looks at her sister Martha and thinks of how good Christ has been to her. She looks at the apostles and sees the miraculous saving power of Christ. And she thinks of how He has blessed her and how good and gracious He has been in saving her soul and rescuing her life from ruin and destruction. And there's this awe. There's this love. There's this appreciation bubbling in her heart. She perhaps looked upon those Jews which had gathered, and she knew their only hope was Christ. And again, her heart was filled with awe and love and appreciation. She looked upon Jesus, and she sees the one and only Savior of sinners. Looking upon Him, she sees the love and grace of God. Looking upon Christ, she sees her Redeemer, her Deliverer, her hope, her joy. Looking upon Christ, she knew that He was worthy and deserving of more than she could possibly give. Looking upon Jesus, no doubt she thought, oh, how precious He is. Oh, how lovely. Oh, how amazingly wonderful He is. And her heart is taken up with Him. And she's filled with wonder. She's filled with amazement. She's filled with awe. She's filled with love for Him and appreciation for Him. Matthew says in Matthew 26, verse 7, that she having, it's in her possession. Again, all of these feelings bubbling in her heart. And she has in her possession an alabaster box of very precious ointment. And she poured it on His head as He sat at meat. Mark says, Mark chapter 14, verse 3, that she having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard very precious, that she brake the box. She broke the seal of that box and poured it on His head. And John says that Mary anointed the feet of Jesus. John doesn't mention the head, he just mentions the feet. So with a heart filled with praise and thanksgiving, her impulse is to break open that box. And she begins to pour that ointment upon His head. And that would run down His body, reaching His feet. And then she falls down before Jesus and washes His feet with her hair. With her hair. So we see her there. She is laying her glory. Her hair is long. She's washing His feet with it. She is laying down her glory at His feet. And she's giving what she had, an alabaster box of ointment. And John says in John 12, verse 3, that when she did this, the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Jesus is covered from head to foot with this precious and extremely expensive ointment. Mary is on the floor at His feet, wiping His feet with her hair. An expression of her awe, of her humility, of her love, of her gratitude, of her praise. This was all very personal, all very real. The whole house is filled with the odor of this ointment. You ever think about what does my life smell like? What does my home smell like? What does the church house smell like? Well, it ought to smell like our awe. It ought to have the odor of awe, the odor of humility, and love and gratitude and praise. And anyone who may have walked in that house after she broke open that box, they could smell what was in the air. That ought to be so. of our lives, of our homes, of the church. What was in her heart, bubbling over, drew her near to Christ. And to the feet of Christ. And what is in our heart ought to draw us near to Christ. And what is in our heart ought to draw us to the feet of Christ in a posture of worship. This is the way to measure the quality of what's in our heart. What does it drive us to? Does it draw us to Christ? What Mary did that day required effort. Christ said in Mark 14, verse 6, "She hath wrought a good work on me." The word wrought implies preparation and effort. And the effort and the preparation was motivated by awe, by wonder, by amazement, by love and appreciation. What is in our heart, does it compel us to put forth effort for Him? What is the direction of our preparation? What is the direction of our effort? People make preparations to do a lot of things in the world. Most make little to none, little to no preparation entering the house of God. What's in our heart? What is it that's in our heart? Also, what Mary did met the approval of Christ. She hath wrought a good work on me. You know what? It really didn't matter what anyone else in that room thought. This is what mattered. She hath wrought a good work on me. What Mary did was purely for Christ. She hath wrought a good work on me. Her priority was Him. Again, what is in our heart, does it make Him the priority? Does it draw us? Does it compel us to Christ? What Mary did was an act of sacrifice. Matthew and Mark both referred to the ointment as very precious. John refers to it as very costly. You say, well, that's one and the same. No, not really. Precious can also mean rare. Costly is the price. The protest from Judas and others, but mostly Judas, John 12, verse 5, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence? A pence was a day's wages. 300 pence is the equivalent of 10 months of wages for the working person in that day. But the cost meant nothing to Mary. Meant nothing. It was for Him. It was for Him. Her attitude and spirit was not how little she could give, how little she could do, but how much. How much can I do? And I don't think that the cost of the ointment ever crossed her mind. It crossed the mind of others, but it didn't cross hers because it was for Him. It was for Him. Also, what Mary did was according to her ability. Mark records in Mark 14, verse 8, that Jesus said, "She hath done what she could." She hath done what she could. Oh, she may not have been able to do everything that others could do, but that's not the issue. She did what she could. She did not have all the abilities that the others had, but she did what she could. She may not have had all the opportunities that the apostles had, but she used what she had, an alabaster box of ointment. If we would simply do what we can in regard to our circumstances, in regard to what God has given us, in regard to others, in regard to the church, what a memory. Remember, it was a memorial unto her. What a memory we would leave if we just did what we could instead of doing as little as we can. What an impression upon lives would be made if everyone did what they could. What would be accomplished if everyone did simply what they could and not worry about what they can't do, but what you can do? What is in our heart, does it fill us with a desire to do all that we can? What was in Mary's heart compelled her to do all that she could. What Mary did was according to faith. We see that in John 12, verse 7. Then said Jesus, "Let her alone. Against the day of my burying, she hath kept this." What she did for Christ was based upon her belief in what Jesus had said concerning Himself. Again, imagine if everyone here believed what the Lord has said and then did what they say they believe. What Mary did was her opportunity. John says in John 12, verse 8, "For the poor always ye have with you. But me ye have not always." She used the opportunity that she had. She did not place the poor above the opportunity that was before her. The poor you have always. We're going to do away with poverty. No, you're not. Because they're always going to be. You're not going to do away with poverty. Doesn't matter how many programs you set up. There's always going to be the poor. But we do not always have this opportunity that was before Mary. We have it every Sunday and every Wednesday for certain. And we have it every day, every other day as well. What was in her heart would not allow her to squander the opportunity that she had. How many opportunities God's people squander? Why? Because they have the wrong thing in their hearts. They have other things other than Christ in their hearts. Thirdly, what Mary, we looked at her spirit, we've looked at her act, what she did. What Mary did was a statement. She made a statement. She made a statement about her commitment to Him. When she broke open that box and began to pour, she begins to pour that ointment, there was no going back. There was no way to gather it up and take it back. One of our problems today is that we always want to leave room to go back. We need to go so far we can't go back. Mary made a statement that day about His value to her. We make that statement every day. We state with our lives just how valuable Christ is. Mary made a statement that day about the value of her possessions in relation to Him. In relation to Him. She held what she had very loosely. She was willing to let go of it all for Him. Mary made a statement that day about His worthiness. She poured all that she had upon Christ. She willingly gave all. By her act, she was saying, Thou art worthy of all. And if I had more to give, I would. What Mary did that day was an expression of her love to Him. May we realize that our lives are a statement. Our lives are an expression. And our lives should state very plainly, should express very clearly that to us Christ is worthy of all. The response of the others, Jesus is covered from head to foot with the precious and very expensive ointment. Mary's on the floor at His feet, wiping His feet with her hair. Matthew records, Matthew 26, verse 8, but when the disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, What is the purpose of this waste? They're there. Jesus is there. And they're filled with indignation. We've seen it many times. Those who profess Christ come to God's house and get filled with indignation. They look at somebody else and what they've done and it just angers them. They were there that day. Those kind of people. John says in John 12, verse 5, that it was Judas who first made the statement about this so-called waste. And this is where the others concurred. So it's a very sad scene in some respects. And that's always so. You consider just the house of God. You can look around and you can look at other individuals and think, wow, the Lord's blessed them. And it ought to fill you with awe, and it ought to fill you with love and appreciation. You look at your own life and you see God is blessed. And you look at the Lord. And your heart ought to be bubbling over. But instead, many times, it's a sad scene. Though there are those who are doing that, there are also others sitting there angry and offended. An opportunity passing by. And it'd be bad enough if they only did it once, but they do it every week. This time, that's their habit. That's their life. So here's a woman who loves Jesus more than she loves her own life, more than she loves her wealth and her possessions. She has sacrificed her rare and very expensive ointment. Why? Because she wanted to worship and honor the Lord. And she worshiped Him openly, publicly, sacrificially, and they ridiculed her and tried to make her feel bad for the thing that she did for the Lord. Don't ever let someone make you feel bad about doing for God. It's never a waste. Never. To give Him all. There's nothing wasteful about it. Never. What Mary did, verse 3 again, and we'll close, caused the house to be filled with the odor of the ointment. What is the odor of our life? What is the odor of our home? What is the odor of the house of God? Everyone in that house experienced the savor of that ointment. It is the savor of amazement and wonder and awe and love and appreciation and dedication to the Lord. A savor that ought to mark our lives, our homes, and this church. Our lives ought to be a fragrant offering to Him. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song, we'll all stand.